defy expectations.
What Stokes has achieved is so special.
Greta Thunberg, Nelson Mandela, even the Jamaican bobsleigh team. They achieved more than anyone believed they could. Peter was one of those people, an unknown, impulsive fisherman who, against all odds, left a legacy that we can still learn from. Maybe if God could use him, he can also raise us above our own expectations. Could we achieve more with him than we think is possible?
Good morning, everybody. I love how Becky says I'm about to talk about when it all goes wrong and then the screen freezes and I can't say screen freezes as I'm about to talk of things going wrong. But yeah, I'm here and we're going to carry on looking at a bit of Peter's story today. But before we talk about Peter's story, I'm going to talk about a story from my life. And I'm going to take us back to 2006. Now, 2006, I am at university. I'm at the University of Warwick, and I actually live just on the outskirts of Coventry with 7 other people. There's 6 guys and 2 girls. But myself and my 2 friends, Mike and Andy, have embarked on something which we thought was rather incredible. Hold your tension, okay? We had embarked on a 3-player online game of Football Manager. And some of you are sat in the room thinking, Martin, you're already a legend. Some of you are thinking, Martin, you should have done different things at university. And some of you are thinking, what on earth is Football Manager, okay? And if you're the latter, you need to do different things in your life. I'm just going to say that. But we had found a way to socialise together while sitting in our own rooms, not with each other. It was brilliant. And we had got this down to a fine art. We'd go to lectures, we'd come home, might get a bit of food, then we'd just disappear back to our own rooms, all by ourselves. And we would play this online game. And occasionally one of us would have to shout at the other to hurry up. I won't tell you exactly what words were sometimes used at that point. And that's what would happen like most evenings. We had it down to fine art. Some of you are really into this now. Just if you're interested, I was Arsenal. We just drew names out of a hat. It's not because I'm an Arsenal fan, but I was doing pretty well. And it was all going really swimmingly. And this is what we used to do. We used to do that on repeat, day in, day out, and we'd occasionally go and experience daylight if we fancied it. But one day, there was a real test for us. Because as we were sat there playing this game, one of our other housemates, Damien, came into my room and he said, Martin, a couple of hours' time, one of his mates from school had managed to get tickets to a gig at a nightclub called the Coliseum in Coventry. It's now defunct, okay? And he said, we got to go in the next hour. And because his mate was like an aspiring music journalist, he'd managed to get hold of some like behind-the-scenes tickets to go and possibly even meet this band. So I did what was the right thing to do, and I messaged Mike and Andy through Football Manager and said, shall we go? And again, I won't repeat the exact words that came back on my screen, but basically it was no. And I was relieved because I couldn't be bothered. You know, I was very happy in my comfort zone and things like that. So off Damien went to this gig. Now, the next day, probably the afternoon, we were students, we saw Damien in the kitchen. We said, Damo, how was the gig last night? Was it any good? He said it was amazing. He said this was the best gig he had ever been to, and he even got to meet the band. And he said, how was your night? And I said, well, it was great. I had a really good transfer window, actually, and made a few good signings. But then I was like, then we kind of sat chit-chatting around it. I said, what was the name of the band? Because these student bands have ridiculous names. What's the name of this band you got to meet? And he goes, they were called the Arctic Monkeys. That's right, some of you are ahead of the game here. I had passed up the opportunity to hear and meet, probably before they were really famous, the now 12 million plus selling albums, multi-award winning band known as the Arctic Monkeys. And if you don't know who they are, just go ask Alexa to play I Bet You Look Good on the Dance Floor. That's them. And I did this all to stay in my room playing a football management simulator. I'm quite good at it, but, anyway. And some of you are sat there thinking a couple of things. One, you definitely made a mistake. And some of you are sat there going, what on earth has that got to do with that video we just watched and this guy called Peter? Well, we're into week 4 of this series now, and we've learned a lot of things about Peter. We've learned that he didn't feel good enough to be a disciple. We've learned that he was incredibly impulsive. He was incredibly brave and also prone to some really foolish decisions on the face of it. And yet, he really believed that Jesus was something special, and he gave up everything to follow him. And if you have missed any of our episodes of this series so far, do catch up online. Well, because of those things, and what I've just kind of let you into an insight about who I am behind the scenes, I've really struggled to kind of see myself in Peter's life. Because I'm not impulsive. I'm not overly brave. And I wouldn't really say that I've done something incredible because of my faith either. And maybe you're a bit like me too. Maybe you've struggled to see yourself in Peter's life. Because that's just what I am. On the face of it, I am very different to Peter. He's this, see the odds are stacked against him, but chuck himself in anyway. And I'm a, the odds don't look so great, so I'll just kind of come up with a better plan, thanks very much. And yet, as I've been prepping for what I'm going to share with you today, I have really started to see myself in Peter a bit more. And maybe you will too. And just a little warning, it's probably not going to be for great reasons if you do. And for today's part of Peter's life story, we find ourselves close to Easter. Now, we're a week away from Easter here. Hardly believable that it's only a week till Easter. But Peter is just one day away from that first Good Friday. And we're going to see his impulsivity again. We're going to see his bravery again. We're going to see his commitment again. But we're really going to see his flaws laid bare for the world to see. And we're going to join Peter somewhere in the middle of the story. And we're going to find him hunched over, weeping. This brave, brash, big, bold fisherman is in a puddle of tears. All because he's let down his mate. He's let down his mate, who he became to see as his rabbi, his Lord, and as Seven shared with us last week, the person he truly came to see as the Son of God. And in fact, much of what we see about Peter today is in stark contrast with what we've seen in the rest of this series. And that's what I connected with, and that's why I think it's worth paying attention to. You see, Peter, in his mind, had failed. He'd fallen short of what he expected of himself and also what he thought Jesus expected of him. And he did something that, as we're going to see, he vowed never to do. And as we delve deeper into this story, I want us to remember this. That it's better to be a follower who fails than somebody who fails to follow. It's better to be a follower who fails, a follower who falls short occasionally, than one who fails to follow in the first place. And I want you to know that despite what we see of Peter in the next few minutes, all wasn't lost for him, and it's not, and that's true for us too. You see, just a few hours before Peter is there in tears, he sat with Jesus and many of the other disciples and a few others celebrating the Passover festival, this annual Jewish tradition. When all of a sudden, and forgive me if this is the wrong thing to say, I think Jesus kind of really ruins the atmosphere. They're sat around having a nice meal, and then he says, oh, by the way, Judas, you're going to go off and betray me in a minute, aren't you? I think that might ruin the atmosphere. I don't know if any of you have been at a dinner party where somebody says, oh, you're going to betray me, aren't you? Probably not. But it would really, really change the atmosphere. And then as all the other disciples are tutting and moaning about Judas, Jesus looks at Peter and he kind of goes, you're not much better either. And I think you would cut the tension with a knife. And Peter doesn't like this, as you probably wouldn't. Peter is feeling a little despondent and a little down. You see, this is what Jesus says to Peter. Peter turns to him and said, Peter, I have prayed for you. I have prayed that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. But Peter replied, Lord, I'm ready to go to prison for you and even death. And Jesus answered, I tell you, Peter, before the rooster crows today, you will deny 3 times that you know me. Can you see that impulsive side of Peter there again? I reckon Jesus is speaking pretty calmly when he says this. He says, Peter, I've prayed for you, but you're going to deny me. And I think Peter kind of gives it the big uns. He's like, nah, mate, I'm going to go to prison for you. I'd even die for you. And I think Jesus then really calmly just looks him in the eye and go, nope, it's not even going to take that to test your faith. It's going to falter in a much more simple situation. And that's the end of the conversation. Whether you read this in Luke's gospel like we have here, or Matthew, Mark, or John's, because they all record this with a few little differences, but all of them believe this happened. That's the end of the conversation. But I imagine Peter is feeling belittled, perplexed, confused, maybe even offended. But maybe deep down, he might have been challenged because he knew that Jesus had a point. Because we don't like it when people say something about us when we know, oh yeah, they're actually onto something there. We really find that hard. I remember just before I went to university, actually, I was having a real wobble about going. I can remember the exact point of the road we were on. I was in the car with my mum going back home, like the night before we were going, and I was having this proper wobble. I was like, oh, I don't want to go. Too scared, because remember, I'm not brave. So I'm having this proper wobble, and my mum, she didn't turn to me. I think she focused on the road, thankfully, and she said, your granddad said you'd say that. Your granddad said you wouldn't want to go. He actually said he didn't think you'd go at all. And what she said got to me because I really cared, and still do actually, what my granddad thought about me. And it kind of made me really sit up and listen. And I think this is the exact same thing for Peter. I think deep down he knew he was susceptible to what Jesus was warning him about. And then you see just a few hours later, the proof is in the pudding. The prediction becomes a reality. And we skip forward to Jesus being arrested, and we see this. It says, then seizing Jesus, they, who would be the Jewish authorities, took Jesus into the house of the high priest. Peter followed at a distance. And once some there had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and had sat down together, Peter sat down with them. A servant girl saw him seated there in the firelight. She looked closely at him and said, this man was with him. But he denied it. Woman, I don't know him. A little later, someone else saw him and said, you're also one of them. Man, I'm not, Peter replied. About an hour later, another asserted, certainly this fellow was with him, for he's a Galilean. They might have even said it was because of his accent. And then Peter replied, man, I don't know what you're talking about. And then it says, the Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. And then Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him. Before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times. And he went outside and wept bitterly. I find that word in there, Peter remembered. It's like a few hours before, he'd heard what Jesus said about this and then just totally forgotten about it, and his impulsivity took over, his bravery took over, and he followed Jesus all the way to where he was in stark danger. But here he remembers. And he remembered that he'd fallen short. Jesus' principal follower had failed, and he's left in tears. And if you're anything like me, you know what that's like, to feel like you've fallen short. All of us card-carrying Christians in the room would have denied Jesus at some point in our life. Maybe through our actions, maybe through our words, maybe through our lack of actions or our lack of words. You know, maybe you're not fully sold out on this Jesus-following business because you look at Christians and you think we're hypocrites because we constantly fall short. And I get it, and to an extent you're right. But when we do fall short, we probably feel guilty about it, just like Peter feels guilty right then as he's weeping in that courtyard. And I think we actually need to cut Peter a bit of slack here, because actually he'd done a lot right. He'd followed Jesus for years, giving up everything that was known to him in order to follow this up-and-coming rabbi, without fully understanding just how special he was. And he follows him all the way to his arrest. And you know what it's like. If the leader's been arrested on trial, you know who they're going to come for next. So he's properly brave. Just like he was brave when he stepped out of the boat and onto the water, as Mike spoke about a couple of weeks ago. And he's there in this fire-lit courtyard where Jesus is going to be put on trial. But then the doubts kick in. And he starts to focus on the what-if questions rather than the who is right in front of him. And he falters. You know, maybe this has been your story before, or maybe it's your story now. Maybe you say you follow Jesus, but you deny him in the most simplest of situations. For me, it's at home with the people I love the most when I fail to act like Jesus would want me to act. Daily. You know, maybe you've followed Jesus so far, like Peter did, and then given up. Maybe this is the reason you haven't been brave enough to be baptized next week yet. Maybe you didn't realize that's what you've done, but now you're sat there thinking about it, you're thinking, oh yeah, I have denied Jesus a heck of a lot too. Maybe you've not been willing to go that next step on your faith journey because you've given over to the what if questions. What if my friends judge me? What if it costs me? What if I fall short? Well, here's the truth. They probably will judge you. It probably will cost you, and you definitely will fall short. But it's better to be a follower who fails than one who fails to follow. Note what Jesus doesn't do. He doesn't condemn Peter or banish him or said, you're not part of my gang anymore. He just carries on with what he knew he had to do. It's like Jesus silently says, I knew this would happen, but watch what I do next to show you how much I still love you. And he says the same about us. He knows we will fall short, but he loves us so much, he still goes to the cross for us every time, no matter what. And if that doesn't give you hope, then the ending of the story just might. Because remember, I said that we were joining Peter's story somewhere in the middle. Well, the ending, I think, brings a load of comfort. You see, Peter, despite his guilt, decided to hang around. Have you noticed that? He didn't then run away. Unlike Judas, who legged it and gave up for good, Peter actually stayed around for a bit and then went back to be with his other disciples, probably still racked with guilt. And then on that first Easter Sunday, he found out that Jesus was even more than he could have possibly imagined. And if you don't know what he found out, make sure you're here next week. And then a few days after that, Peter finds himself beside a fire again. But this time he's beside a fire on a beach. And the risen Jesus is back having fish and chips on the beach, essentially, with his disciples. And this happens. It says, when they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, so the same Peter we're talking about, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said, you know that I love you. So Jesus says, feed my lambs. And again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, again, still Peter, just had changed his name. Do you love me? He answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus says, take care of my sheep. A couple of things here that really stand out to me. One, Jesus doesn't use the nickname for Peter that he's given him, Peter. He goes back to his actual name, which kind of says he's really trying to get at the heart of who he is. And when he says this, do you love me? That word love is where our English language falls short, because in the original text in Greek, that word love would be agape. It's one of my favorite words, and it basically means unconditional love. So when Jesus turns to Peter and says, do you love me? He's saying, do you love me more than all of this, all of your other mates, all of the fish, maybe even fishing, because that was his background? And then when he says it the second time, do you unconditionally love me? And Peter's like, yeah, you know that I love you. So take care of my sheep then. Do you love me? Do you love me? And then he says it a third time. Simon, son of John, do you love me? And this time he doesn't use that word agape. He uses a word called phileo, which is, do you love me as your real close friend? And it says Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time. Some of you are ahead of the game here. I reckon Jesus was hurt when Peter denied him the third time too. He says, do you love me? He says, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. And Jesus said, feed my sheep. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will just dress you and lead you where you don't want to go. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God, and then said to him, follow me. Do you love me as your friend, Peter? He's digging really deep because he wanted that deep relationship back with Peter, and he wants that with us too, and he wants us to follow him. I think this is Jesus showing he knows Peter really well, because he knows he's got that reputation for that rashness, that hasty decision making, and I think he's really digging to make sure that he was sure. And he gave Peter a real stark warning there. What did he say? He said, very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you're old, people will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you don't want to go. Because Peter would end up like this. Just like how Jesus was killed. You know, he's given Peter another out. He denied him 3 times, but he's given him another out after he said that he loves him 3 times. But this time Peter has resolve. This time Peter doesn't bail on it. And I love that this story is just beside a fire again. I think that's amazing that the denial was by a fire, and yet this kind of reaffirmation, this refocus is by a fire again. You see, because I think Jesus will give us chances to recommit to him, maybe in similar ways to where we have denied him in the first place. Just like he does with Peter. And we can know that Jesus has already made up for our shortcomings through his death on the cross. So church, where do we go from this? Do you go to the courtyard fire, or do you go to the fire on the beach? Do you choose to deny, or do you choose to follow? You know, maybe it's time for some of us in the room to actually choose to follow properly for the first time. You know, some of us would have held back from the fears, the fear of the reputation, the fear of the cost, and the fear of falling short. But let me tell you this, if you take those fears to Jesus, he'll squash them. He's actually already killed them off if you take them to him. So maybe that's where you need to go next. Maybe it's time for some of us to refocus. You know, once Jesus was arrested, Peter focused on those what ifs rather than who Jesus was, who Jesus is. But then he really saw who Jesus was again and reaffirmed his commitment to him. And maybe that's what some of us need to do this Easter, to follow him more closely again after having denied him in so many different ways before. Or maybe, I'm going to use a very churchy word, maybe some of us need to confess. Maybe some of us need to confess where and how and when we have fallen short. And just say, Jesus, I'm sorry. And he'll say, I know, I got you. And he will have his arms stretched wide to welcome us back, even if we have denied him before. And if we let him, he will use us just as he used Peter, knowing that we will fall short. Because remember, it's better to be a follower who fails than one who fails to follow. One more thing, and I love this bit. The whole time this was happening, Jesus would have known exactly what Peter was going to do. If Jesus is the Son of God, he would have known, right? He has to have known. He wouldn't have known Peter was going to deny him. He would have known Peter was going to falter and fail, but he still chose him, and he still died for him. And he still chooses us, and he still dies for us, knowing we will falter and fail as well. You know, being a Jesus follower doesn't mean you have to be perfect, and kind of that's the whole point of why Jesus had to die, why he was here. All he asks is that we do our best to follow him as closely as we all can, and he'll make up the rest. And what of Peter next? Well, Peter went on to lead the disciples in creating the church. He was Petra, the rock that the church was built on, and Peter became known as the first bishop of Rome, or as it's most commonly called now, the first pope. And in the year 64, under the instruction of Emperor Nero, Peter died via crucifixion after having gone to prison for following Jesus. I'll go to prison for you, I'll even die for you. Well, he did, but with some failures in between. But it's better to be like Peter and be a follower who fails, rather than one who fails to follow. Are you ready to follow?